And this is the last session before the breakouts on funding innovation. Funding is a very important part of innovation, so we're gonna hear a lot about that, and we want to have real active participation in this. I'll briefly introduce the panel for this session, starting with Daniel Behr, who's the Senior Vice President of Access BridgeGap Ventures, Martin Vogelbaum, who's a partner at Row Ventures, and Barbara Dalton, who's a Vice President of Venture Capital at Pfizer. So we'll maybe just get things rolling with Ben.
Yeah, so just to remind you, we wanted this to be as interactive as possible, so come up and you can ask questions at the microphone, and if you're not comfortable with that, I'll be constantly refreshing the Twitter page, so you can just tweet in the questions with hashtag SINAInnovations, and I'll ask them up here. So I guess the first question we'll start off with is, I thought this was an interesting one that we had discussed before, but how do you think we can fund important topics where corporate interest is currently kind of weak, like in Alzheimer's or CNS, or where the incentives for funding are generally weak, like in the developing world? And any one of you can take it.
Well, I guess I'll start. I think that even in areas like Alzheimer's, where you said corporate interest might be waxing and waning, really, it goes up and down. I think at the end of the day, if you have an innovation that truly is knock your socks off kind of thing, I think that you will always attract funding, is sort of the way I've looked at it. The challenge is that a lot of people have innovations that might not be knock your socks off kind of innovations, and so there's a little bit of noise in the system, if you will, but if you overcome that, that's okay. In terms of the third world question you asked as well, that I think we have a company, for example, that's a vaccine technology where there are applications, of course, for third world, but also applications for the developed world. So I think that in the case of at least venture funding, you do have to have, profit-minded kind of a thing. But I think that you can embed the third world applications into a broader picture. That's my view.
I think that your comment about, for example, Alzheimer's not being of significant interest these days is probably not exactly correct, in that it is a phenomenal interest for those from the small companies as well as the large companies. The issue associated with it is it's all called research for a good reason, and we're not exactly sure what the right mechanisms are to go after to try to impact the progression of the disease, and it costs a lot of money to target those types of diseases, the types of trials that we are required to do. And so I think that there we may want to be thinking about different paradigms as to how to have things tested. For example, in the traditional oncology development model, you have to go in patients who have failed everything, which I think has probably killed a lot of potential good therapeutics as a consequence of only being able to take the patients who have survived. They have survived, as has their tumors or their cancer survived, a lot of treatment. I think it's particularly true in the Alzheimer's disease space because it's a slow progressing disease. However, at the very beginnings of that disease, people feel fine and they're not really sick, in quotes. But I don't believe you're actually going to change the outcome of a disease like that unless you can intervene early. So this is a major, and I'm not suggesting that this is a position or platform for the company that employs me, but I'm saying we need to think about how we develop drugs differently for some of these, terribly, intractable diseases where we have put a lot of money into, continue to put a lot of money into. And the other thing I'd like to suggest is I think we need to look at working together as opposed to separately in order to tackle some of these difficult targets like Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I think that there was a lot said in the previous panel that I hope we all get a chance to respond to. But I think what calls into question is who's going to fund innovation going forward. And whether it's these intractable diseases like Alzheimer's or it's even ongoing third world endemics, epidemics like malaria and the like, is coming up with new ways to finance those opportunities that are beyond what has been traditionally financing those opportunities, which has been primarily the venture community to a large part. And what you're seeing happening now, and I think it's a theme that we'll probably touch upon a lot during this panel session, is You know, innovation is being neglected by the venture community for reasons that we can get into later. And I think innovation is going to have to find a new way to fund itself, whether that's through third-party groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, some of the other foundations that have arisen in certain disease areas like the Leukemia Lymphoma Foundation, which has been very active in funding earlier stage research. And even the government at some point is going to have to intervene, because it's not even beyond just innovation or therapies that have gone and not been funded or exposed like Alzheimer's, but thinking about the next generation diabetes therapeutic, where, again, to Barbara's point, you know, these are very long trials that the agency is now requiring, specifically longer-term prospective outcome studies for cardiovascular events that are just not fundable from a private standpoint or even from a pharmaceutical standpoint. And there are still many sick refractory diabetic patients out there, and these trials are not going to get funded. So something's going to have to give, something's going to have to change. But I think the way innovation gets funded from here on out, and it actually has started already, is going to have to fundamentally change. And there's going to be a multifaceted means by which these innovations are funded, whether it's Alzheimer's or it's diabetes or it's a third world epidemic.
Great. All right. I'm going to start walking through the audience and handing the mic out here.
But
we can, yeah, and I'll throw out a question too, maybe just to try to get a read on. You know, I wouldn't say that the pharmaceutical industry has over the last several years been the model for funding innovation in the more disruptive sense. So we hear a lot of the complaining about the FDA requires this, and it's hard to do that, and the trials cost a lot of money. You know, where's the disruption? What are the models that can be brought forward to fund things in more innovative ways? Is it possible to go outside the country to gain some kind of traction to make the regulatory burden easier? Are there ways to disrupt that regulatory burden to push things forward? Like, where's the thinking outside of the box at in this kind of setting?
I think historically that came from the small startup companies. I think that I'm old enough and have been around the industry long enough to remember the days when the pharmaceutical industry said we would not make proteins as drugs. Needless to say, everybody wants to make a protein as drug today. But the industry in general has not been one of those disruptive innovator type groups. It has taken upstarts, from the likes of the early days of the biotechnology industry to prove it to them that there was not only a therapeutic utility, but also a business involved in disruptive technologies. I think when it comes down to, if you think it's hard to get scientists to disrupt the way they're thinking, the regulatory environment is even probably more rigid, and it's rigid for good reasons, to protect, the recipients of drugs, et cetera. But it's very hard. Even the biotechnology companies took that on too. They went to the FDA because they had nothing to lose. They went to the regulatory environment and said, this is what we can do, and we're going to do it this way, and we want you to work with us to figure out a way to get there, as opposed to having us follow the path that every other pharmaceutical company had followed before, in subtle different ways, et cetera. A large pharmaceutical company jeopardizes every single file it has with the FDA, as well as its financial strength, by sort of fighting in that level in that position. But if you're a small company and you've got one product and you're going to live or die by it, your motivations and your approach to the regulatory environment, to the financing environment, etc., is very different. I dare say that the shareholders of most of the large pharmaceutical companies would not like those companies to take that approach, but it usually takes a young upstart to start to move things around. Now, this comes back to our circular argument here, is if we're not financing the young upstarts, how are we going to make those changes? But I personally see some changes occurring in the pharmaceutical industry, but disruptive, not exactly what I'd put in, I'd use the term talking about major pharma.
Yeah, I would say that I wouldn't necessarily characterize that the FDA is the root of all evil here at all. I think the problems that we see, so when the companies that we've started and we funded recently, of course, the regulatory path is always a consideration, don't get me wrong, but that's not the concern. The concern are things such as starting with, okay, is my baby really as pretty as I think it is? That's the key lesson that I've taken I'm also an engineer by background, so I know that people don't necessarily bother to ask, and that's been a theme here, to really, really be objective about whether what the innovation you have is truly, truly an innovation that is going to have a market acceptance. And I think people don't necessarily know how to ask the next question. The question is always, don't you think this is cool? Yeah, it's really cool. And then they stop there. When, you have to keep asking, well, is it cool enough for you to buy it? Is it cool enough for you to, So that's, I think, one challenge that we have. The other challenge is, which again, people have talked about here a lot, has to do with having enough money around the table, if you will, to take things to the point where they have a real value inflection point. There's a lot of bridges to nowhere. Nobody wants that. The days of taking something with a couple $100,000 to do some experiments and then we all are, go to the bank and are happy, that's not necessarily true. You need to have millions and millions of dollars. And in terms of innovation, in terms of how we fund these things, you see a lot of pharmaceutical companies now trying to play nice with academia, for sure. And I did spend 4 years in tech transfer at Harvard, so I know Terry's job pretty well, but it's a challenge because they don't necessarily know how to play well together. Then you also see companies playing with venture capital. And again, that's nice, but there's different people that have different pieces of the value chain. And I think the challenge for all of us is to recognize when the baton has to pass from one to the other, making sure that there are no gaps in that chain.
All right, Ben has a...
So we had a couple questions on from the Twitter. So one person asked, this morning's speaker mentioned a tax on medical devices. How does that tax affect your decisions to invest in various biotech companies?
Well, we haven't had that same kind of, and this is more on the, once you're approved and on the market, it's not dissimilar to what the PDUFA fees have been. So I don't think it's a tax. I don't think taxes are really an issue. Actually, there was it 2 years ago, we had the tax rebates that we were able to sort of, for in-process research, we were able to effectively get tax rebates. So taxes haven't been a rate-limiting step on a financing standpoint.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I think it is afternoon. I'm Larry Kleinman. I'm a pediatrician and a health services researcher. And so I think of innovation a little bit differently. And I have two questions, one of which is focusing, and then I'll move from that to a more overarching question. But when I think of innovation in my world, it's not innovations in terms of drugs. It's innovations in terms of approaches to delivery, approaches to measurement, the health services component of the healthcare system. So does thinking about that change your frame of reference or how you would answer some of these questions? And then I have a more overarching question that derives from that.
I would put healthcare services and changing that into the same category of there may be innovative opportunities there, and I'm sure there are, and I know there are. I had experience investing in those areas too. But I think that it is a bit harder for understanding the acceptance of it, the lack of sort of what I'll call intellectual property protection. There's nothing like a patent on a new chemical entity, believe me. And a good idea, particularly when they come from the technology side, gets replicated immediately. Just look at every phone that looks like an iPhone today, in an 18-month cycle. So there are some barriers to protection, I would say, in that space. But it's not to say we don't consider it in the landscape. My group actually has an investment in an investment fund for healthcare in Africa, and the whole goal of that fund is to look at the rollout of healthcare in a very bottom of the pyramid based community to see how healthcare will be brought to those individuals that will be completely different than the way healthcare is delivered in the developed world, or the way it developed in the developed world, let's put it that way, so that we can try to figure out what role the likes of a major pharmaceutical company can play in that and where one should be positioned. But this is way ahead, and it all addresses the delivery, the process, at a very rudimentary level in Africa.
Thank you. And the overarching question I have relates to thinking about ROI of an innovation portfolio. And that is, sometimes there are gaps that need to be filled. And if you can fill that gap and everybody recognizes both that it's a gap and that it's filled, those are the home runs. But again, thinking in terms of health services, many times what we actually do is can change processes incrementally. And then at some point, it becomes transformative. But you don't know exactly where the transformation point is. So in order for that to happen, there needs to be, if not 1,000 flowers blooming, at least a corner of the garden that is cultivated with a variety of flowers. And so what's your thought about how you think of ROI in a complex space such as delivery or even drug development, it could be for that matter, where you know that certain things may be building towards the future, but you haven't reached the future yet, and then at some point, where is it you say you cut bait or the future is today?
I don't know if this answers the question, but I think that goes back to some of the issues that had been discussed before in terms of the investor's patience, right? If you're a traditional venture capital fund with a certain time horizon for, how long your fund, how long you have to invest that fund, how long does it take before you start raising your next fund, et cetera, then you might have a slightly different mindset about something like you're talking about, where you have to have a very long time horizon, and maybe the ROI over that time horizon looks okay, but it's a long time horizon. And so maybe if you're a traditional fund like that, you wouldn't be making those kinds of investments. On the other hand, if you're a patient investor like we think we are, that our investor wants to build companies long term, then it's less important. In either case, you still have to have the vision, though, or the view of are you building something that the world really needs, wants? That's how I define innovation at the end of the day. Is it, or at least in our, what we're talking about here is sort of stuff that becomes not a nice to have, but a must have. That's, yes, no, not even a question. I want that. And if it takes 10 years to get there, patience is a big piece of this, I think.
All right, Dr. Kagan?
It's hard to see from down here.
Yes, I know. I think Martin was starting to get to this, and I just want to push this. So is biotech a good investment for venture capital, and what do you think the relationship's going to be in the near and distant future between venture capital and biotech?
Is it a good investment? It has been in the past. Is it going to be a good investment going forward? That remains to be seen, and it's certainly, for me, it's all about how my limited partners, my investors, perceive biotech. There was a fundamental change that occurred in the 2000s. Just a background, I come from Roe Ventures is a diversified fund, so life sciences is a very small part of a bigger organization that focuses on the information technology and social media, Twitter space. So I actually get to see how all the technologies, we also have an energy practice as well, but I get to watch them all in parallel. And I have to say that in those particular sectors, biotech is looked at as the ugly brother, the ugly sister, that the returns aren't there, that the velocity isn't there, that, putting in, my new media partners can put something, a little bit of money into something for, the third screen, so you're watching television and you're on your iPad and you're communicating with your friends and you're not making any money, and Facebook buys you for $500 million in 3 years. And I can't compete with that. I can't compete with that in biotechnology. But if you look historically at the returns of biotech versus the other sectors, they're about even. And in the venture world, they're abominable. In fact, if you told me, should I be investing in a venture fund in 2000, looking at the returns, even in the top quartile, the top decile returns that are sort of in this single-digit IRR, you would have had better luck, putting money, putting it into a shoebox and letting it sit there. But what's happened for the venture industry in biotech is that in 2000, you had the first internet bubble burst, and funds like ours that were having trouble raising money, barely being able to scrap together $60 to $90 million. All of a sudden, we had $400 million in our laps. And the issue with the biotech side of things is that we, Barb and I have been in this business for 20 years. Back in the day, you put $5 or $6 million into Human Genome Sciences, which was the first deal I was involved in, goes public, it gets to $1 billion market cap in 1996. It's a blowout because we had that kind of a public market, and that's the way it functioned. And there was a lot of innovation, a lot of platform technology being funded then because funds were nimble, they were smarter. They put their money, they had a much broader portfolio, less money at risk. You have $500 million. If you think about how you're going to generate a return on $500 million, it means you have to generate $1 billion worth of value. Now, I go back to the new media situation, and if you look at companies like Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr and LinkedIn and all these companies, tremendous velocity where you're looking at 200-300x's, where these are fund makers. In biotechnology, if you're able to get to, $100 million return, that's a home run. So you have to get 10 of those in a portfolio of 20 to 30 companies. And most often, if you look at the ones that have generated the $100 million returns, there's been upwards of $100 million plus put into those companies. Right? So what happened in the last 10 years is that there's been an influx of all this capital. Right? And the capital had to be put out because that's how we sort of invest and go out and raise more money. But what it's done is it's seriously hurt the venture industry because the investors have looked at our returns and the returns haven't been there for that size money. And you can make the argument that good venture funds shouldn't be managing $500 million because there's just no way to generate those kinds of returns. So I think biotechnology continues to be a good investment if you invest wisely and you invest smartly. I think the industry is going to contract. It's already happening. And I think that's for the good. I think a lot of this has to be wrung out. And I think we have to go back to some extent the way the industry came about in the 80s and the 90s. How that evolution is going to happen, how quickly that's going to happen, what the impact will be is unclear. The impact immediately will be that you won't see as many companies funded by venture capitalists. And this is why I go back to my original statement about funding innovation is that even we have to figure out ways to work with pharma earlier, or we have to work with foundations earlier. We have to find other ways that we can leverage other people's capital against our capital so that we can push innovation forward, because the old venture model is just not going to be around to sort of fund the panoply of companies that have been funded in the past.
All right, I'm sorry, Dr. Bottinger had signaled me before he stood up, so we'll go with him first and then, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Urban Bottinger, Institute for Personalized Medicine here at Mount Sinai. And I want to pick up perhaps on what Dr. Kleinman had introduced, that is, how can new technology really change, revolutionize, transform the delivery of healthcare, the delivery of standard of care guidelines. And I'm shifting the focus a little bit to health information and health information technology. And we were just last month or so at Health 2.0 out in the Bay Area. And it is absolutely amazing how many people are now developing apps in this area with specific focus, and how many small startups are in this space now. And it is clear that this is up and coming and has probably a very large impact on health service and delivery. So my question is, how do you see this sector specifically of software, health information management, capabilities in this area evolve over the next 5 years or so? And what would be the key features that you look for in new technology in this space?
You want to go?
I'll make one comment because it's quite close. Recently, as yesterday, one of the members of my team came forward with this, hey, I saw this really cool company, California, they've got this really great algorithm for going through large sets of data and all that sort of stuff, and they think it's going to be really critical in, genomic handling, personalized medicine, whatever you want to talk about. But it's also very good for traders. And the question was, do you think we should look at it? I said, I'd tell those people to go after the traders. There are more customers for them. There is more money to be made, and those people spend a hell of a lot more money on software technology. One of our issues in the whole healthcare space is our customer base is not that huge. It's not like every single one of you is going to use those technologies. The payers are going to use them. You know, the major medical centers are going to use them. It's not, you know, a lot of those technologies, at least those that should be considering taking down venture capital, are usually for a small group of people, and so the market is not that large. The good thing, the great thing about this is a lot of those technologies can be developed, you know, without venture capital. Don't take venture capital if you don't need it. Don't take venture capital if you only need, you know, a small amount of money. If you can develop a technology with a small amount of money and beg, borrow, and steal to do that without selling a big hunk of your company to the nasty people like Martin and myself who are going to tell you what to do, even though we don't know what we're talking about, you know, you don't want to, you know, if you don't have to. So there are other ways. What I really like about it, there are other ways to get those applications developed because they're not as expensive as developing a drug. You know, what do you need? You need some electrical power, some computing, some databases to play with, et cetera, and things like, and some really smart people, maybe 3 or 4. You don't need a regulated, you know, government-regulated environment. You don't need, you know, phenomenal chemistry. You don't need $100 million, you know, to do it. So you can actually test your hypothesis. You can get to what we call classic proof of concept with a little bit of money. And do it. I encourage everyone to do it and try to see what's going to change. All those apps aren't going to be successful. Maybe a handful of them will be, but they'll get out there and they'll get tried. And the what I'll call the ecosystem will sort through them. But they're not the kinds of things which are in need of, I would say, the high cost dollars of venture capital, in my own opinion.
All right,
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
thanks for waiting so patiently.
That's okay. I was thinking about in the case of complex products like biomaterials where you have multiple components and there's multiple levels of intellectual property around those products. For a company, say a new company, you're just starting, you want to be attractive to funders. What would you say percentage of your project should be focused on, you know, new IP, so you have your innovation projects, versus what percent should be focused on building on already existing intellectual property? Just from a funding point of view.
Biomaterials specifically?
No, that was just an example because they're complex products, and they have 2 different regulatory paths. And
biomaterials is, well, I guess you could say one and the same. You know, for example, we have a small biomaterials, it's a coating company that was funded, it actually came out of Penn. It was funded by the Ben Franklin group in Penn and Metrotech, so the little sort of seed groups in the UPenn sort of environment that funds that. And we put a little bit of seed capital into that. Obviously, IP is always critical. It's not expected that you can have issued IP, but you know that you've got freedom to operate at least at a very high level. You know, this was it started as a coating company for antibacterial, and now they want to make it a component of the swipe screen on your iPhone and on your iPad. And I'm not going to get into the metals and the various components that go into that. But basically, we told them to go out and get strategic money. So they've gone out and talked to BASF. They've gone off to talk to TPK, which is a big Korean company that's one of the biggest manufacturers of the glass for the swipe screens. And I think that's a trend that, you know, I would tell a lot of these, you know, sort of younger innovative companies that, assuming you've got the IP and everything, you know, what's helpful for us as validation is to have a large strategic at least come back and say, you know, is interested and interesting enough that we would like to invest. Now, I think there was a question that was circulated, pardon me, Eric, there's a question that was circulated around, I think, initially about Barbara and you know, how we traditional venture capitalists look at corporate venture capitalists, and I have to say that has changed.
You mean you didn't always love me?
I always loved you. I always loved you.
20
I loved you as
years,
a
and
kid.
now you're finally
it's
telling me
okay.
this.
It takes 20 years, you know. At least I don't have an email trail. But in any case, it's changed now. So I think, you know, for example, we just had Barbara come in and make an investment in one of my companies, and I think that the validation that Pfizer brought to other investors and the level of due diligence they did, now I think more than ever is grown in importance for other people to sort of take at more than face value as something that could have, you know, commercial potential.
One comment about IP, which is important. I think, you know, there's always this tension between the intellectual property. If something's coming out of an academic institution, the intellectual property that's owned by the academic institution that's then licensed to the company, and then the IP that the company then generates either on top of or around or, you know, above and beyond that. And I think that that's an area where I think the funders and the company and the institution have to work well together to figure those kinds of things out. In some cases, the companies don't want necessarily to be licensing technology that comes out of an academic institution that where you know they were prophetic license or prophetic patents, I should say, where at the end of the day maybe those particular compositions of matter may end up not being the ones that are taken to market. And so there's always, I think, an important collaboration that has to happen there in terms of, you know, existing IP, new IP, and so forth.
So before you go, I wanted to, because it feels a little sort of depressing to me to keep hearing this message, but you know, we live in a pretty amazing city, New York City, and it's a very philanthropic city. And what would your views be on, you know, so these people are donating lots of money for, you know, driving lots of different causes, and haven't necessarily locked onto the whole venture philanthropy sort of model. So if in the sort of traditional VC space, it's, you know, the funding's tough, you don't see the ROI, you know, just not making sense for you. What about pushing, you know, what about the view of pushing a more venture philanthropy sort of model where we start tapping those others who are big philanthropic givers, but using it to start, incubate companies, maybe get them to a point where they become interesting to folks like you?
It's kind of interesting because that's the nature of the nature of our group is exactly that, right? So we started off by, our investor is or has been a philanthropist in the sciences and decided to move, you know, to leverage some of that work and do something more in the commercial realm of things. So maybe that's a new model that's emerging. In fact, people, I've heard the term coined almost like a professional family office or a professionalized family office or a venture family office or something like that, which is a little bit of what we're doing. Where, you know, there's still a philanthropic side of things, but then there's also an investor that has a different time horizon and so on that wants to move more towards the commercial venture side of things. And of course, Gates and other people are doing this more and more too. Some of the disease-focused groups are doing more of that as well. They're expecting some of what they give out to come back, to keep things evergreen and so on. So that is something of a trend right now, I think.
I think that some of you from a purely academic perspective might not like that trend, because remember, historically, your foundations basically gave grants, period. There was no payback. You're doing good work in the area of the disease that my family suffers from, et cetera, so I'm very interested in that. And now I think it moves in a better direction. While you may not receive the same amount of dollars because it's going someplace else, maybe to a lab which is doing something more applied, or maybe to a startup company, but I think if everybody keeps in mind the topic that we've talked about earlier, that it's about the patients and it's about treating diseases, et cetera, I think we can get there. I do know that I was specifically asked to be on the board of a foundation many years ago because they wanted to start the venture philanthropy model, and that was the Institute for the Study of Aging, which is now the Alzheimer's Disease Research Foundation, and I have since stepped down from the board. But that organization started using the venture philanthropy model, which was basically copied by you know, the Fox Foundation and the CF Foundation, and not copied, you know, inappropriately, but basically sat together and shared, how are you doing this? How are you providing funding in academic environments that then gets translated into the development of a product that can be useful? Specific example in particularly my case, which touches on all areas, is we funded an academic lab at Penn, which was making you know, PET imaging agents for beta amyloid in the brain. That funded the academic lab and the postdoc there, the MD PhD student there. That MD PhD student went off and started a company which became Avid Radiopharmaceuticals. We as a venture capital group invested in Avid Radiopharmaceuticals, and ultimately, many years later, you know, a PET imaging agent was approved by the FDA for the detection of beta amyloid in the brain. The foundation made money as a consequence of making a grant to the academic institution that also would convert into an ownership position in a company should a company be created. So I do think it is coming. I think that any of you who are working with philanthropic organizations who don't have that mechanism, and you have an interest in seeing your technology advanced, you may want to have a discussion from your side of the table with them as to how that can work. Pushing and pulling in different directions can really help.
So we had a question on Twitter, and I'm actually interested in this as well as a student. This is directed for Dr. Dalton. How did you transition from your PhD work into this world, and do you have any advice for students wishing to pursue a similar path?
I'm sort of an accidental tourist in the venture capital world, and like our speaker from the media area this morning, I basically volunteered my time when I was a research scientist at then SmithKline and French laboratories. I spent many years in academia in the process of getting a degree and advancing, and learning my science, et cetera. And then I spent 10 years as a research scientist in the pharmaceutical industry. And very different experiences, both wonderful experiences, I would say. But while I was a scientist, I actually volunteered my time. And if you remember our speaker this morning, he said, he went over to that guy who was wearing that MTV jacket and said, hey, So what I did is I gave of my time to, help them with diligence around deals that they were looking at. This was in the 80s. This was in the late 80s. I didn't know I was doing that because I was interested in a job in venture capital. Believe me. Nobody knew what venture capital was in the late 80s. I mean, you could go to a cocktail party and say you were a venture capitalist, and they looked at you with this dumb stare. But the reality of it is I did it because I was curious. I was a scientist. I was curious. I was very interested in what these little companies were doing. They all happened to be working in my particular area of research at that time in the corporation. In fact, the only competition was in the small companies. And so I found it a way for me to stay connected on competitive intelligence. I found it a way to understand and learn a little bit about it. And when I came time for me to leave the lab, and that was purely a personal decision that 20 years in a lab, maybe I should grow up and do something else, stop wearing jeans every day. And I decided that I'd look for another business opportunity within the pharmaceutical industry where I worked. And I called my friends at the venture capital group and said, hey, I'm diligencing a job over in this area. Do you know that guy? And they said, well, we don't know him, but why don't you come work for us? And it was because I had fostered a relationship, a network, well before I needed it. And I didn't try to get close to them because I needed a job or I wanted a job. I didn't even know what they actually did other than they needed some scientific input. And so I just agreed one day to leave the lab and move to the venture capital group, and they were very kind and taught me, brought me up, in an environment which, allowed me to, change careers completely differently. I'm not quite sure that happens today. In our industry, we have got what I'll call even quadruple threats of people who want to enter the venture capital world. They're MD, PhD, JDs, MBAs. I mean, they've got more education and less practical experience than anybody on earth, but they all want to be venture capitalists.
Yeah.
My advice would be get some real world job experience. Big companies, small companies. You can't make any mistakes. Just if you're liking what you're doing, keep on trying.
I second that because I think it's really important if you're going to be on the investment side. I'm lucky because I spent the last 25 years on all sides, right? I started a bunch of companies. I was in tech transfer and now on the investment side. But I think that's what gives people a unique ability to really understand all the aspects of this. And I think without that, it doesn't work. And I think there's a lot of VC funds out there that don't have that operating or industry experience, and I think I don't think it helps.
All right, so that's going to wrap it up for us in this session. Let's give our panelists a hand. Great set of questions and responses.
Really fair.